Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, from wherever you are joining us today. My name is Alexander Stubb. I'm the director of the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute. We have a wonderful treat. Conversation with the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. Together in this conversation, we also have Professor Ottmar Edenhofer, who is the Director and Chief Economist from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. We have Jos Delbeke, who is our own, the EIB Chair for Climate. And we will also have a Q&A session with Kurt Vandenberghe, who is working on the European Green Deal in the cabinet of the President of the European Commission. Now, what we've seen is a Fit for 55 package with 13 legislative proposals. And we will give the introduction to President Ursula von der Leyen in the middle of what has been a, unfortunately, very practical climate crisis that we've seen with the flooding in Germany, in Belgium, and in the Netherlands. With these words, we give you the optimistic view. Welcome and thank you ever so much, Ursula, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Alex. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. Thank you very much for setting up this panel discussion so quickly after we presented indeed our package last week. And yes, there is a renewed sense of urgency that we need to deal with climate change. Science is telling us since a long time that climate change is real. And as you've said, Alex, this is underscored by the extreme weather phenomena, as we've seen in Canada or now in Europe this week. And there are no words to describe the human suffering and the destruction they cause. But I think we must also be aware of the effects of such events in poorer parts of the world, where, for example, droughts and fires devastate livelihoods, or where failed harvest endangers the survival of so many. And I only mention this because it underscores very tangibly the cost of non-action against global warming. Of course, the cost of climate action is real, and we're going to speak about it. But it will probably pale in comparison with the cost of non-action. And it is not too late if we act now and if we are ambitious. I think this is also important to keep in mind. Now, as you've said, the European Commission presented a legislative proposal package of 13 proposals last week. It is kind of our roadmap to reduce as cost efficiently and as fairly as possible the greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030. Europe is now the first continent that has a concrete plan to reach its ambitious climate goals. And we build on more or less 20 years of experience with European climate and energy policy. The key points of the package are the following. The first big pillar or overarching principle is we put a price on carbon and we put a premium on clean solutions, on new technologies. We set emission standards for cars and energy performance criteria for buildings. And we couple this with social compensation and an investment framework. Then the second big pillar is that in addition, we agree targets for member states, targets for sources of energy, for infrastructure like charging and refuel station. And we set targets for sectors like, for example, agriculture and land use. Now, with the presentation of the package, the work is not at all done, it is only starting. And we all know a proposal is only as good as it is approved and implemented. We have lots of explaining, listening, and negotiating to do. And this is why I value webinars like this one, even in the middle of the summer. And I would highly appreciate if scientists and policy experts like you participate in the overall debate with society and speak up about the need for effective climate policy. Now, from the Commission side, we will be open to any feedback and on how to make the transition even more cost efficient and fair. Don't hesitate. Now, finally, for this introduction, allow me to share with you 5 messages about this package of proposals. Firstly, the debate in Europe at this moment is no longer a debate about how much we should cut greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, but how to do so. That's good. Because with the EU climate law we have in place, 27 member states and the European Parliament have bound themselves by law in a democratic process to become climate neutral by 2050 and to reduce emissions by at least 55% by 2030. So 2030 is not the end point. It is a milestone on the way to climate neutrality. Secondly, reaching our climate goals requires a whole of society transformation, also a whole of economy transformation. So every sector counts, every member state has to contribute, and everyone matters one way or another. The third message or principle is solidarity and social inclusion are at the core of the package. So we propose to reinforce solidarity between member states, but also, and for the first time, we propose to organize solidarity within member states. The new European Social Climate Fund that we're going to create is a clear expression of our commitment to make this transition fair. So we have to ensure that vulnerable low and middle income households feel the benefit of the transition. The fourth message or principle, this package is designed to enhance growth and foster innovation. It's our new growth model. We all know that we have reached the limits of the old fossil fuel economy. And we have the resources and we have the innovation power to grow on a new model, on a circular economy with less pollution, more resource efficiency, and a better care for our natural environment. And on top, Europe has a first mover advantage because the entire world will need solutions to reach a sustainable and clean economy. And here, Europe is the front runner. And last but not least, we are more open than ever to international dialogue and cooperation. We know that Europe only represents 8% of global CO2 emissions, but we are responsible for a higher share of cumulative emissions. So this means we need and we want to work with our international partners. The Paris Agreement is the suitable framework for this global endeavor. In November this year, the world will come together again to increase our collective commitment. And I trust that our partners will see Europe's climate plan as a source of inspiration, but most importantly also as an invitation to work together. And here the element of, or the proposal of the carbon border adjustment mechanism is exactly conceived in that spirit. And Europe is already today the biggest contributor to climate finance for the least developed countries. This will stay in place. So in sum, my message is we want to organize solidarity within our member states, between our member states, but we also feel obliged to support the most vulnerable elsewhere in the world. With that, Alexander, I hand the floor back to you, and I'd be happy to take a few questions.
Thank you, Ursula, very much for that very concise presentation with 2 pillars and 5 key messages. And let me once again stress that I think, I look at it as a father of two teenagers. And I do think that when they go back and have a look what Europe did in this particular field in the summer of 2021, if and when it materializes, they will be thankful. And what I really like about this whole package is, of course, the holistic and overall approach that you're talking about. In many ways, it's not a finger-pointing exercise. It's more of a solution exercise. And that is exactly what we're going to need. And that's why your approach of helping people out within, between, and outside of the European Union is extremely good and helpful. And as you said, we all know as former civil servants and politicians, this is a beginning of a long road to do the things we need to do in our fight against climate change. And European leadership here is unquestionable. With these introductory words, I will hand it over to Professor Ottmar Edenhofer for the first question.
Madam President, as a European citizen, I'm very excited about the EU Green Deal. And I think many people in Europe share this excitement. As an economist, I feel very encouraged by the EU Green Deal because carbon pricing is a very important cornerstone. And in particular, the new ETS, the second ETS for transport and building seems to me a very, very important step forward. But we all know that there are a lot of resistance in the member states. And my main question is, what do you intend to do to gain the minds and the hearts of the European citizens to support this very important carbon pricing proposal?
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Edenhofer. And you have been and you are a pioneer on the question of carbon pricing. So I learned a lot from you and in our conversations. And the two of us and many listening or watching this webinar here, we all know that this transition has to be just and will be just, or it will not be. And indeed, the social dimension is the most discussed within the Commission, within the college. And we have already investment sources in place, like, for example, the Just Transition Fund. But let's have a look at the ETS itself, the second ETS on buildings and road transport. So first of all, we should keep in mind energy poverty exists already today. Our estimates are around about 35 million people. And so far, we have not addressed specifically this topic. Then the second comment beforehand is, we know that carbon pricing works, and it is the most technology neutral, thus innovative mechanism, principle, and it's the most cost-effective one. We have the experience with carbon pricing on industry and energy production already. And there we've seen that it has over-delivered. So it worked better than we expected. That's good. Now let's have a look at the second ETS we want to build on road transport and buildings. First of all, we will introduce it gradually. So from 26 on, so that the price can gradually increase. We have the instrument to make sure that it's a smooth introduction. And it will immediately be accompanied by a social climate fund. This social climate fund we will introduce already in 2025. So first the social climate fund is in place, and then we start the emission trading system, or the costs, putting a price on carbon. How will this fund be? What are the sources for this fund? It will be resourced in the first year from the EU budget. And then when the ETS starts, the revenues from the emission trading systems go 25% into that fund. It will be co-financed by member states with 50%. So to give you a number, over 7 years, we will have, is our estimate, round about 144 billion euros. And here it is important to keep in mind that there are two principles how this social climate fund will work. It can be used, for example, as direct income support for low incomes, vulnerable households and citizens. It can also be used, for example, to boost innovation and to invest in the development of clean technologies that help exactly those households then over time to be able to work with the transformation, what mobility is concerned or what, for example, housing is concerned. And here is important that the different member states, as we know that in different member states, the situation is different, they design their plans and these plans are approved by the Commission. This is a principle that we have made very good experience with now with the next generation EU recovery plans. It works very well because then the plans are owned and designed by the member states. But with the approval of the Commission, we make sure that the overall common targets of the European Union are kept by every member state. Now, the investment and the direct income support are sourced by that social climate action fund, combined or coupled with the emission trading system. If we would not introduce this emission trading system, then we do have to acknowledge that we will have to do the transformation anyhow towards minus 55% in 2030. So the transformation will take place, perhaps through more intensive targets or norms and standards. But without a social climate fund then, no ETS means no social climate fund. Introducing this ETS that makes sure that overall the CO2 emission is reduced and using the social climate fund to invest in new technologies and to support the low income households is, in my view, the right way to address the topic.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Next question comes from our very own Jos Delbeke.
Thank you very much, Alex, and good morning, Madam President. Congratulations, which is a truly impressive package. I cannot agree more on the role of carbon pricing. And I also would like to congratulate you with the coherence of the package. I think the extensive economic analysis that led to the package, because it's very diverse, is really reassuring for the future. And I hope that in the institutions we can have that continued. I have a question to you on the carbon border adjustment. You rightly indicated how important it is to engage the world. But if we look at our imports. The exporters look at the EU. And we have three sorts of international partners. The first is the US. When John Kerry was in Brussels, he was not truly supportive of the idea. He said, it's really a measure as a last resort. Now, a second category of, and the United States is not introducing carbon pricing quite likely under the Biden administration, unfortunately, I would say. The second group are the emerging economies, China, India, South Africa, Brazil. They were not making very friendly points on the EU on this issue, and they said they may turn into a protectionist mood, and that would not be a very good start of the debate. And then the third category are our neighbors, like Turkey and Russia, not with whom, both of them, we have not easy relations. So my question to you, Madam President, what kind of diplomatic efforts is the EU, the External Action Service, also the trade instruments that we are having, the WTO, what kind of efforts we are going to jointly undertake to convince our partners that this is a good measure, that this can be turned into a measure that is helping the climate change and not particularly Europe's position forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Delbeke. Thank you very much for addressing the question of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So for me, it's interesting to see just the fact that we put the proposal on the table has already spurred a very interesting positive debate because it widens the scope on the global dimension intensively. up to today, as we all know, we have prevented the carbon leakage by issuing free allowances. You can do that, but this is very much inward looking, if I may call it that way. It's like giving some relief, what the carbon pricing is concerned, to the most energy intensive industries, for example, and therefore supporting them directly. But the carbon border adjustment mechanism has a different scope. It opens the question to the global public. How are we together working with the effect that there is a lot of CO2 emissions still, and that polluters should pay the price for emitting CO2? Now, first of all, it will take a certain amount of time to introduce the carbon border adjustment mechanism, around about 3 years. And we will work, of course, with our international partners and do the diplomatic outreach during that time. It is very important that the principle of the carbon border adjustment mechanism is not to protect our industry, but to protect the integrity of environmental goals and to prevent the carbon leakage, so that it kind of stimulates the overarching headline or topic for all of us. We want to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Now, of course, we have to make sure that is WTO compatible. With the phasing in of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, of course, we have to phase out the free allowances in the relevant sectors. But these are technicalities. The most important part is the message the carbon border adjustment mechanism sends. It is the message, those who come with carbon heavy products will have to pay a price for that. You can choose, if you export your goods, for example, to Europe, whether Europe is putting the price on the CO2 CO2 footprint in the product by having the carbon border adjustment mechanism. But we would also prefer that you put a price on carbon in your country and therefore keep the revenues. So, for example, if we are discussing with China on that topic, China already has, of course, understood it is much more cost efficient and innovation boosting if they start an emission trading system and put a price on carbon, therefore creating the level playing field to our industry, and thus keeping the revenues for the carbon price in their country instead of paying a carbon border adjustment price when the products that are carbon intensive or have a carbon footprint come to Europe. That is the overall principle. And finally, 2 more points. You rightly so were asking the question for the developing countries. Here, the most important task of us all is to be serious on the climate finance. As you know, there should be an increased amount of really financing the agreed amount of 100 billion euros. Europe has done so in the past by paying 25 billion euros into the climate finance, and you can rely on us that we will continue, because over time, the investment in innovation in developing countries to reduce the greenhouse gas emission or the carbon footprint is much, much more important than anything else, because it's the only way to enable those countries to be finally at the level playing field with other developed countries, what clean technologies and sustainable solutions are concerned. And finally, from the principles I've described, the best scenario would be if at the very end, the carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe does not generate any resources anymore, because those who export to the European Union also have at home a carbon price, and therefore we do have a level playing field all over the place what greenhouse gas emissions are concerned.
Now, for the final question, Ursula, let me piggyback on your second to last point. I mean, if you look at the climate crisis, I guess the big dialogue is quite often between three measures that can be taken. One is regulation and regulatory. Second is innovation and technological. And the third one, perhaps this comes with my old EIB, Werner Hoyer climate bank type of a hat on, and ask you the question that how do you intend, as the European Commission, to generate innovation and finance, which will then eventually get us out of the climate crisis? So what are your solutions and pointers for that, please?
Yes, thank you, Alex. I am deeply convinced Europe is the continent of scientists and innovators. Yeah. There's a long tradition for that. And indeed, as you mentioned, we really have to invest in this ability to innovate. And therefore, there are different sources, and I'll go through them systematically. First of all, there's a big package which consists of the European budget and Next Generation EU, altogether 1.8 trillion euros. 1/3 of that is clearly earmarked and dedicated to go in investment in green projects in the European Green Deal. And I've started to look now at the first 22 member states where we have approved the plans. And let me grab a table. That is interesting to see. Those member states alone have already now, through their Next Generation EU recovery plans, allocated 200 billion euros in green measures. So this is clean transport, this is building renovation, energy efficiency, the circular economy. So very targeted into projects that are there to boost them. Then we can go a step, let's say, back into research and development. As you know, Horizon Europe will allocate more than 35% in its resources to climate-related research and technologies and research and innovation. And this is complemented by the Innovation Fund. The Innovation Fund will be more than doubled in its size, and it is resourced by ETS revenues. Then there is a very interesting program we have started now to work together with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation concerning, we call it Catalyst Program, concerning to cover the so-called green premium. So if there's a new clean technology going to the market, it always has, of course, a certain green premium where we want to cover this green premium to boost the market feasibility of that technology. It's very interesting. I met yesterday with Bill Gates to discuss that. So we bring in private financing, foundation financing, and we will look at technologies that are breakthrough technologies, for example, in sustainable aviation, in hydrogen, and energy storage. So to really systematically look at what is emerging at the beginning of the market, still too expensive, where we can support in the green premium, but make sure that these who are front runners really then are able to cover the market and of course then go down with the prices. There's another dimension I want to mention because the European Green Deal is about innovation, but not only in technologies. Therefore, we have created the movement of the new European Bauhaus to address the creative industry, to address the cultural industry, because it matches style with sustainability. So this dimension also is very important to bring the European Green Deal forward, this movement. And we should not underestimate the strength that is coming and the power that is coming from this grassroots movement that we see growing now. Last but not least, I want to have a look at the capital market, because there, of course, you can also push by the issuance of green bonds and the taxonomy. there's an enormous amount of capital out there that is looking for sustainable solutions, that is looking for the interesting green projects. And with the green bonds, with the taxonomy, it is also possible to channel this capital right away into these new sustainable solutions we have. So it's a whole bundle, a whole mixture of instruments we are using, but you're absolutely right. We focus our policies and our investment on the three topics. It is the European Green Deal. It is the digitalization. Without it, the Green Deal will never be possible. And it is creating more resilience, the third topic where all the investment and the focus goes to.
Great, Ursula, we really appreciate this. You know, there's a saying that it's not the commission that makes the agenda, it's the agenda that makes the commission. And I had the chance to meet a few of your team 2 weeks ago, Maros, Jutta, and Vera, and had long discussions with them. And I think your commission in many ways has broken that myth, because to a certain extent, yes, the agenda made the first year of your commission, and second, with COVID, the health crisis, the economic packages, the Next Generation Europe that you did on that, that was very reactive, and you did the right things, very difficult decisions. But secondly, with the climate thing, it's actually the opposite. It's you are making the agenda on that. And in that sense, you've broken a certain norm with what the Commission does. And I feel quite strongly also that you guys need a little bit of a break. You've basically been at it ever since you started. So I hope you have your last meeting of the College of Commissioners tomorrow or next week. And then you are able to take a little bit of a breather and come back to the drawing board again at the end of August. It's been a great privilege for the European University Institute to have you in this webinar, as much as it was to have you during our State of the Union address. And thank you also to your team for making this happen. And with these words, I wish you a very nice summer, Ursula.
Thank you so much. The same for you. And it's wonderful that you invited me. Thanks a lot, Alex.
Vielen Dank. Jos, I will now hand it over to you, and you'll be chairing the rest of the session and the conversations that we're going to have. And you know, if I had a choice, Jos, it would be great if you guys can have a Q&A and find some solutions to the questions, not only on Fit for 55, but with the different sort of holistic polluters that the president talked about. I mean, we all know this, that you know, making things is about 31% of CO2 emissions. So cement, steel, and plastic. Then plugging in all electricity, that's about 27%. Growing things is 19%. Getting around is 16%. And keeping warm and cool is about 7%. If you can give us a few percent to help us out to bring down the 51 billion of tons of greenhouse emissions that we emit per year, we'd really appreciate it. Over to you, Jos. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. And I think you make the pertinent points in putting the whole thing into perspective. And as we are waiting for Kurt Vandenberghe to join us in a few minutes, I had a look at the chat box, and I would like to tell to everybody that please come forward with your questions. Peter Vis, my colleague at the EUY, is grouping them because it's always a challenge to have them focused. But Kurt Vandenberghe, welcome to join us. It's a real pleasure to have you. Kurt is the senior advisor of the president in the cabinet. And lots of questions coming in, Kurt, in particular on the climate social fund and what is going to happen with what the president just announced, also the solidarity inside the member states, and what is going to happen with the money that is raised through the new ETS system and that is not going to be spent in the climate social fund. So that I think is a first cluster of questions, a lot of attention on that. In the meantime, I would like also Ottmar and Alex to come in if they have additional comments after Kurt has taken the floor. So give me a sign, we can have a lively discussion. So Kurt, on the social fund, social climate fund, the question and the microphone is addressed to you now.
Thank you very much, Jos, and good morning to everyone. And thank you indeed, as the President said, for organizing this webinar. We really have a lot of discussions to have on this whole package so that we all understand what is in it, because it is quite comprehensive indeed. It's a whole of society transformation. The new Social Climate Fund is indeed one of the most emblematic parts, I think, of this whole package. A lot of the package consists actually of strengthening existing pieces of legislation. The Social Climate Fund is one of the few new initiatives in this whole package. Why do we do it? Well, we do it because, as President von der Leyen is saying, we know that carbon pricing works. It is probably the most cost-efficient way of sending incentives into the market, into the economy, into society to change people's behavior. We know that we can only do this if there is effective social compensation, because carbon pricing will have a bigger effect on some in society, especially vulnerable low-income and middle-income households compared to others. So for us, it's been very clear we need carbon pricing in these sectors that are very hard to decarbonize, driving, heating and cooling, but this can only work if there is effective social compensation. So one and the other go together. There will be no carbon pricing without such a social climate fund. What we have said, therefore, is that the revenues from this ETS on road transport and buildings should be reinvested into helping those parts of society that would really need it, and that should feel also the benefit of this climate transition. It's a kind of climate dividend, if you like. So that's why our proposal to the member states is that of the revenues they will get, 25% should be transferred back to the European budget. That will create the European Social Climate Fund. We will invite member states to come up with social climate plans in which they will say how they will use the money to address energy poverty, mobility poverty, by giving direct income support where necessary, but especially investing in the renovation of buildings, making them more energy efficient, and making sure that households that are at risk of mobility poverty have access to clean mobility solutions. Be it electric vehicles, for example, we could think of big leasing programs in regions or in member states, or through clean public transport. We also propose to require that member states will co-finance these plans, which will then be approved by the Commission to make sure that it responds to the criteria and targets set at European level and agreed at European level, that they co-finance this with 50%, for which they can use the revenues they will get back from this second ETS system. So overall, this will create a volume of 144 billion euros over 7 years for social compensation, direct income support where needed, but especially investment in clean housing and clean transport. What we're also very clearly saying to the member states is that we would hope that the other 50% of revenues, which will go back to the member states, would also be used for effective social compensation. If the member states decide that there should be more going to this social climate fund, we will certainly not object to this. Why do we say this? Well, we know that if we do it in this way, we actually have a triple win: environmental, economic, and social, because we will accelerate the switch to clean solutions for heating, cooling, and driving. That in turn will also take up the demand for these new solutions. We will preserve the single market by avoiding that member states go into their own solutions for decarbonizing road transport and building, heating and cooling, which they would otherwise need to do because they need to meet the target. So it is a support measure from the European Union to the member states. And thirdly, most effectively and most importantly, it creates revenues and resources for this social compensation. What is also important, and I'll conclude on this, to know is that within that social climate fund, we also foresee a European solidarity between member states. So for the first time, we do not only compel and enable our member states to address energy poverty more than has ever been done in the past, but we also organize solidarity at European level between member states, because those member states with the highest rates of energy and mobility poverty will also get more resources, relatively speaking, from this social climate fund. So all in all, we believe we have a proposition to the member states that will avoid disproportionate impacts on vulnerable households.
Thank you very much, Kurt. And I note, and it was one of the questions in the chat box, the possibility for member states to organize direct income compensation, which is a very new element. You know, we never went, I think, nowhere in Europe so far into that kind of direct repaying those who are in need because they are at the risk of increased energy poverty. Ottmar, I see you want to come in. And one of the questions, Ottmar, that is in the chat box is, should really the car user and the home owner or the one who is living in a house be addressed? Should not the big polluters come in? You know, is one of the questions always coming back on carbon pricing. May I add that to the questions that were raised? Ottmar, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very important conversation. My question is, so we have now two ETS systems. ETS 1 consists of industry and the power sector, the second one on building, road and transport. And the reason, at least this is my reading, why the Commission has decided to propose two systems is that they want to avoid a price convergence at the very early stage, because otherwise this would lead to emission reduction in power in the industry sector, which is more than 80%, and this is too demanding for this sector. So therefore, they decided to have two separate systems. But one important ingredient for this is that we can have two different price trajectories. My question is, do you think that the market stability reserve in the second system is sufficient to ensure two different price trajectories? My first question. And the second, so what is your thinking about the long-term convergence of the two systems? So I didn't find any precise comments in the package. It might be my fault, but it would be nice to hear what are the thinking of the Commission is about the long-term convergence of the two systems beyond 2030. Because it seems to me this is important also for the traders in the market, because they will anyway form expectations about the long-term convergence of the two systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ottmar. Kurt, may I pass the question straight to you? You know, on the long-term convergence of the two systems, is there any preset scenario that the Commission may want to consider? Kurt.
Yes, thank you, Jos, and thank you, Professor Edenhofer, for this important question. First, I should say you're absolutely right. We create a separate but adjacent system for road transport and buildings in order to make sure that that there is a gradual introduction of a price incentive for these sectors, only starting in 2026 and preceded, as President von der Leyen was saying, by the Social Climate Fund, so that the social compensation comes first, and only then comes the price carbon signal for these sectors. Maybe important to note also here is that already 30% of the building sector is covered by the first existing ETS, because the electricity, also for heating and cooling, is under the ETS already. So what we're doing now with the second ETS, we are leveling the playing field for the building sector as well as for the road transport sector by making sure that fossil fuels are not escaping this carbon price system. What is also important is that we did not want to set up one system for all sectors, because we do not want to erode the integrity of the existing ETS for energy and large industry. That works well, and we don't want to undermine or question that dynamic there. And secondly, for the second ETS, we want to have it managed in a rather controlled manner so that the introduction of the price signal does not create a big revolution. That's why we will only start in 2026. And we have taken our precautions to make sure that there is no big shock on the system then. How do we do this? Well, there are different arrangements, and we have, of course, learned from the experience with the first ETS system, with which we now have more than 15 years of experience. We will start with additional excess liquidity at the start. We will inject allowances for 130% of CO2 represented by these sectors, so that we're certain that the price is low at the start. And we will then have a linear reduction factor, a yearly reduction of the cap in this sector. Secondly, we have proposed to introduce an automatic market stability reserve in case the price goes up too much or down too much. But thirdly, and this was also part of our discussions in the Commission, we have also introduced an emergency brake into this second ETS, so that the Commission, and that's what we propose to the Member States and the Parliament, the Commission can intervene at any moment into the market, injecting more liquidity in case we see that the system is not gradual enough. We want a structural increase of the price for carbon in these new sectors, but we want to have it done in a gradual way. And we believe that having this possibility of a more political, less automatic emergency brake will also help to counter possible speculation. Now, on the longer term convergence, I think it's the vision of many people, many experts, that over time, in the long term, there should be one price, carbon price signal in the market. So we indeed see the possibility over the long term for the two systems coming together and having only one price. But this will be way into the next decade. Our package of proposals has a perspective, now a time perspective, mostly of 2030. We go a bit beyond in certain proposals. For example, the Social Climate Fund will run until 2032. We propose some targets for some sectors like land use and forestry by until 2035. But overall, our time perspective is 2030. The convergence of the two systems is something that will certainly be discussed and envisaged, but not in this decade, I would say.
Thanks very much, Kurt. Another big pillar of the package, and that really comes out of the questions, is on the renewable energy. Lots of people are asking themselves, why is the Commission not reconsidering what they did in the past? That is to define targets for member states separately. And one of the questions related to renewables as well is, are the overall targets, okay enough to green the European economy? We move from 32 to 40, but we should go even higher. And one of the related questions is the use of biomass. Are the considerations related to biodiversity and the maintenance of our forests not be under threat if too much wood biomass is being used in the renewable electricity development? So lots of questions related to renewables. Over to you, Kurt.
May I, Kurt, also add that the debate
Alex.
in Finland is quite vibrant on the forest and biodiversity. So if you could open your thinking on that a little bit. Just a side note.
Thank you, Alex. I'm not surprised. So Kurt, all the usual questions always appearing when we are discussing renewables, but this time around, you are proposing a clear way forward. Over to you, Kurt.
Thank you, Jos. And indeed, forests has been one of the most intensely discussed subjects in the run-up to the presentation of Fit for 55. More than cars, I would say, which was the case a few years ago. That's why I sometimes jokingly say to my colleagues, forests have become the new cars in the European debate on climate and energy. But first on the renewable energy targets. We indeed propose to go to a target of 40% by 2030. We know that this is possible, it is feasible, it is ambitious, we should not underestimate this, but we know from the national energy and climate plans that member states will probably overshoot already the target that we currently have for 2030, which is 32%. So it is a success story. We still have some way to go. That's why we also propose in the Renewable Energy Directive, which we propose to revise, a number of enabling conditions. For example, to facilitate the permitting that is needed to have wind farms or solar farms installed. We propose new arrangements for cross-border cooperation between member states so that it can be done collectively by different member states together. We also propose arrangements for corporate power purchase agreements so that we have sectoral or cross-sectoral approaches to investing in renewable energy, etc., etc. So yes, we can do 40%. It is possible. It will require a lot of work, a lot of planning, a lot of permitting. Is 40% enough? Let's see. We set a target of 40%, but we will not stop the dynamic if we see that we go beyond 40% by 2030, which we should not exclude. We have not proposed binding targets for the member states. We have proposed indicative benchmarks for member states. So we are saying in our proposal what we believe the capacity is of each member state to increase renewable energy sources. Member states will report on this in their national energy and climate plans, and we will track and monitor what member states are doing. And we will have the possibility, if member states and parliament agree, to go back to the member states and exhort them to do more in case we see they are lagging behind. Now on to biomass. A very important subject, one that creates a lot of passion, also among the technocrats of the Commission, if I may say so. It is very clear that bioenergy will have an important role to play if we want to meet our renewable energy targets and our carbon or climate goals. But we want this to be as sustainable as possible. And that applies especially to biomass and woody biomass from forests in particular. So what we have proposed there is that we do open up the sustainability criteria that are in the Renewable Energy Directive, which was not that easy to do because these have come into effect just at the start of this month. And we're already proposing to strengthen these sustainability criteria. We are clearly saying, for example, that wood should not be taken from biodiversity-rich primary forests. We are lowering the threshold of installations that use biomass that should be subject to such sustainability criteria. We lower it from the current 20 megawatt installations to 5 megawatt installations. And we say what kind of wood should not be used for burning for energy. In addition, we also now introduce in the Renewable Energy Directive a cascading principle, which says that the wood should be used primarily for those applications where there is the highest added value. In other words, if you have stem wood, round wood, which is of high quality, that should not be burned. That should be used for other purposes, like, for example, construction, or furniture. And what we propose there is quite a demanding set of criteria for state aid regimes, for national support mechanisms, to avoid that national support with taxpayers' money is not distorting the market in how it wants to live up to this cascading principle. We will need a lot more wood for all kinds of purposes. So we have to make sure that the wood is used there where it has the highest added value. And that is a story we are also developing in our forest strategy, which was also adopted on the 14th of July, where clearly from the European level, we are now saying, let's work together with all member states. We have no intention of coming into the different member states. And I know in Finland, this is a very sensitive subject. We will not come in and control the way you manage forests. But together, collectively in Europe, also if we want to send the right message to other countries in the world, we need to make sure that we protect and use our forests so that they increase the carbon sink potential, preserve our biodiversity, and have the most sustainable multifunctional use possible, so that we value forests, we protect them, but we now can also use them and then also safeguard the socioeconomic interests of member states and communities that depend on our forests. And that's part of the whole holistic story, the systemic approach to our climate goals, which is about much more than simply cutting emissions. It's really about transforming in the way we live, the way we work, with the way we move, the way we eat. It really will impact every facet of our life.
Thanks very much, Kurt, for this elaboration on forests, because it's really a lively element of the whole package. And if renewables would rely in the future too much on it, we could run into trouble also in the greenhouse gas emissions related to it. Now, one of the other elements that I see coming up in the chat box was the element that was raised by Alex before on innovation, technological innovation, the investments required for that. And a basic principle has always been technological neutrality in the decisions made at the European level. Now, phasing out the combustion engine, the internal combustion engine for cars, is not particularly technologically neutral. How would you look into that? And I see that Ottmar is also raising his hand. So if you allow, Kurt, I first move to Ottmar to add a few elements, because cars is very much, you know, a lively element, as you were indicating before. Even if it comes after the forest, you know, it remains a very important element. Ottmar, you want to add a word?
Yeah, so one more questions on the relationship between the second ETS and the effort sharing regulation, because it seems to me that many NGOs are quite concerned that the new ETS with a European cap now might lead to a situation where the responsibilities of the member states could disappear. It might be useful if you could explain a little bit more the relationship between the effort sharing regulation and the current ETS. I call this the ETS2, and how this relationship works. It is my understanding basically that this is a quite smart construction, because when the effort sharing regulation will not deliver, so then the cap will become binding, and then the cap has to deliver. But you might elaborate a little bit more on this important aspect for the coming discussions.
Over to you, Kurt, and perhaps as I had a watch at the clock, you know, these are two different questions, perhaps also your concluding thoughts, if you could add them, Kurt, that I think with respect to timetable we agreed upon. Over to you, Kurt.
Thank you very much, Jos. And I'll take Professor Edenhofer's question first, because it is indeed very important. Theoretically, in principle, we could have said, let's introduce an ETS for roads, transport and buildings, organize that at European level. We then have a carbon price system for these sectors. and we don't need the effort sharing regulation anymore. As you know, today, 40% by and large of emissions are covered by the first ETS, 60% are covered by the effort sharing regulation, where basically we set targets for member states. So we could have said, let's take out these sectors from the effort sharing regulation and have them subject to a European emission trading system. We have not done so, precisely to make sure that there is national accountability for these sectors, which are different, very different from one member state to another. We cannot have a one-size-fits-all. We have not changed the scope and the principles of the effort sharing regulation. That remains based on, for example, GDP per capita, adjusted for cost efficiency, etc. What we have done is increase the targets for member states by an average 10 percentage points, a bit more for some, a bit less for others. That will increase the convergence of efforts between member states. But we know that member states on their own will have a very difficult time to meet these higher targets for 2030. That's why we come with a series of measures at the European level to help the member states deliver on these targets. So they support the member states in their action, and they're complementary. One is the emission standards on cars and the energy performance of buildings, which will come later this year. Another one is, of course, Renewable Energy Directive, the Energy Efficiency Directive. There are a few other elements in the package as well. But then also, indeed, the second ETS system, organized at European level, but there to be complementary and supportive to the action of member states, with a very clear, as I said before, social compensation dimension, so that the whole transition is socially fair and inclusive. So in this way, it is complementary, it is mutually reinforcing, rather than exclusive of one another. On the cars, indeed, almost as important as the forest these days, we are technologically neutral in what we have proposed, because we are not prescribing any technology. We are not saying that there is no future for the internal combustion engine. If there is a solution with internal combustion that is zero emission at the tailpipe by 2035, this is entirely possible in line with the proposal that we have made. We know that today, electric vehicles and possibly hydrogen powered vehicles, especially for heavy duty goods, are probably the most cost efficient, most attractive ways for clean vehicles in the future. But we cannot exclude any other technological development, and we have clearly signaled in our proposal that the Commission will report every 2 years on new technological developments and how they can contribute to zero emission mobility by 2035 for road transport and by 2050 overall for the whole transport system. It's also very important to understand that the emission standards for cars, we're going for zero emission at the tailpipe by 2035, is accompanied by other proposals. For example, for a quicker, more substantive deployment of charging and refueling infrastructure. And another one, very important, as mentioned before, is the second ETS, which will accelerate the switch to cleaner driving solutions and the procurement by consumer of such cars. And in this way, we create a virtuous cycle for innovation, for creating the lead markets of the future, and we make technology and innovation work. And that is really, and I'll conclude on this, Jos, if you agree, that is really a key principle of the whole package. This package is not about saving the planet by going to live in the caves like in prehistory. This is really about a better future, a more healthy future, a future of prosperity that is shared for all, thanks to the power of innovation and investment. That's why the economic agenda in this whole climate and energy package is as important as the environmental goals. And added to this is the social justice, which is at the core of everything we propose. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kurt. And before I hand over to Alex, I cannot resist, formulating a couple of takeaways. What we have heard today is a very wide package, and I would invite everybody that is going to be involved in the policy making in the coming months and years, not to overly concentrate only on the one legislative act that they are going to consider. There are so many linkages between carbon pricing, as you were indicating, and technological innovation, and the green taxonomy, and the social element, not only in the regional terms, but also between social groups. So I think that is very important, not to lose sight of the overall architecture. And that is where I welcome very much, and I congratulate the Commission, that on the coherence, so much attention was paid on solid economic analysis. There are always trade-offs to be made, but it has to hang together. And I think from what we heard from the President and from you, Kurt, I'm reassured that this coherence hopefully is going to be maintained as well in the legislative activities of the Council and the Parliament. The other element I take away is the strong role for carbon pricing, the traditional ETS and the new ETS. I think that's very important, and I would hope that also in the forest and the wood part, we can, develop in the future or in the field of agriculture a reward for all those who can avoid carbon. The social element, I think both the President and you, Kurt, were elaborating quite in an important way on that. The social correction, the energy poverty, that's what needs to be fought, and there is a good concept there. It may provoke a lot of thoughts at the level of the member states, because they are all very different in terms of the distribution or the nature of energy poverty, given the energy markets, etc. But a very important role for the member states, and that is what I took from you away, Kurt, that the member states have a role that has to complement with an equal amount, at least, the activities that are going to come from that ETS. And finally, the emphasis on new technology. And your concluding words, Kurt, we are not wanting to go back to the Middle Ages or the Stone Age. We are in a society that is, relying on high tech, and that's very important. Before moving to Alex for the concluding words, Ottmar, your takeaway from the discussion in a few minutes, and then we move to Alex.
Yeah, so a few words. So first of all, it is a comprehensive package with very important cornerstones. And again, the package clearly shows that the Commission is committed to come up with a package which is effective, which leads in the end to emission reduction in a cost-effective way, and it is socially just and fair. The compensation component is very important. It is quite clear that whenever you put a price on carbon, so that drivers and landowners and tenants have to pay a price, and this is how pricing works in a market society. But what you can do is you can compensate low-income households, and this is very, very important that people understand this. And there is also this aspect that you can use the revenues generated by carbon pricing for supporting investments. So that's very important. And as the President said, there is no social fund without an ETS, and there is no ETS2 without a social fund. And this is something which people should have in mind when they think about this proposal. The second aspect is that there is a technical, but nevertheless a very important relationship between the effort sharing regulation and the ETS2. So the responsibility for the member states does not disappear. And it is important that the member states take their responsibility, but when basically the effort sharing regulation does not work as a compliance mechanism, we can feel assured that the ETS2 can work as a compliance mechanism. And the last point is, I think the package clearly shows that we should avoid by any means that we are pushed back to exclusively national climate and energy policies. We need a genuine European climate and energy policy. This is very important. And the European Green Deal is, from my point of view, a very strong signal, not only to European member states, but to the whole world, that Europe is committed to a European-wide energy and climate policy. And this is my last point, a very important implication for the international negotiations, for the international scene. When Europe is perceived as the continent which is really committed to climate and energy policy and puts carbon pricing at the core, this should encourage the United States and should encourage China to also think about this proposal. We all know that the Biden administration will not put a carbon price very soon, but I think over the longer term, so we have to create a level playing field. China, Europe, and the US are responsible for half of the worldwide emissions. If we would include Japan and India, we would have 2/3 of the global emissions. And we need control over the global emissions. Otherwise, we cannot avoid the risk of dangerous climate change. In that sense, I feel very encouraged, and this is my last word. As a European citizen, I feel proud of this package, and I hope in the end this package will survive the whole legislation process.
Thank you, Ottmar, and I share being proud of what has been achieved and of the package that is on the table. We are on a good journey. It's going to be challenging, but we are all very committed to it. May I close my part of the job and hand over to you, Alex, to have your take on the debate that has evolved this morning. I thought we were touching on the really tricky parts of it, and I learned a lot out of this discussion, at least. Over to you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Jos, and Dito, I learned a lot as well. You know, I'm not an expert like you or Ottmar or Kurt are, but it was a debate really worth following, an interesting one. And I was trying to figure out, you know, what sort of ties everything together, right? I mean, if you look at the Commission program, there are three basic targets there. One is climate or the Green Deal, one is tech and digital, and then one is a geopolitical commission, right? That's the Commission bit. Secondly, what did we talk about today? Well, we talked about the impact of climate on the economy, on politics, and on social affairs. Again, broad. And finally, we talked about the instruments that we can use to solve the climate crisis, which was regulation, innovation, and finance. And of course, Jos, you know, what is the one word that ties all of this together? It's transnational. So basically, we're working on solutions which go beyond borders. And let me stress, and you know my European conviction, that you know, in the next months, even a year, we're going to see a lot of public discourse and debate on specific issues linked to the 13 legislative proposals. But it's very important for us to distinguish between the daily noise and the subjective criticism, look back at the whole package, and have a serious thought about what the Commission has actually done. It's often very easy to be cynical about what comes from Brussels, but with this case, it's not. It shows global leadership, it shows courage, and it shows audacity. And when the package was released last week, I also liked the sort of calmness with which it was done. And I think it was clear in the beginning when the Commission President spoke that we're not anymore debating the targets. We are debating the solutions. And I am, to use your phrases as well, very proud of the work that the Commission did on this. And now we'll see where it all ends up. It's obviously not going to be pitch perfect. It probably will be a little bit suboptimal, but it's a really good package. And finally, I just want to end by thanking both Jos and Kurt for putting this event together. I think it's really important that the Commission does the outreach, has a conversation about an essentially complicated package. And the fact that we were able to do this in the middle of the summer, get Ottmar involved as well, has been, I think, a great credit to the work Jos, Peter, and your climate team, and also the whole EUI climate team, the School of Regulation does at Florence. So many thanks to all of you. With these words, I wish everyone a good summer. I will go on a Twitter break, but we'll put a lot of pictures on Instagram from the Finnish archipelago. Have a nice summer, everyone. Enjoy it, and thanks for joining us today. We were over 600 people at best. That's great. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.